Okay, a lot of people look at this day specific like our children look at Christmas. They got to wait a whole year, finally, until that second week in February rolls around, when the two best teams in the National Football League get to meet on the bowl of all bowls, the Super Bowl. A lot of people wait for that. And you know, most NFL players, because their careers are so short anyway, the game's so violent, that's why we all like it. Because the game is so, their careers are so short, most NFL players never even come close to playing in this game. It's almost next to impossible to get there. Players wait patiently, they train aggressively, they buffet their body daily in hopes that maybe, just maybe in the future, they'll have a chance to play on the world's biggest stage. And so many things have to be right. I mean, you've got to have the right mix of coaches, you have to have the right chemistry of players, you have to have the right personnel in key positions to play in the Super Bowl. For all those things to come together, it calls for crazy patience. Crazy patience. And I think what goes unnoticed a lot of the time in this pursuit on something that calls for patience is the secret behind the pursuit. There is a treasure that is often overlooked. You guys may have heard this. Just 2 years ago, an unbelievable find was located in southern India in a very well-known Hindu temple down there. This temple was built back in 1566. It was, and has been, and until recently, it was open to the public 24/7. It was unguarded. It was never explored. It's really a magnificent temple. Somebody had the harebrained idea, you know, with something this fantastic, has anyone ever thought to kind of explore underneath and around and see if there might be more to this temple than is there? So permission was granted, and they started exploring, and they found hidden vaults, they found secret chambers, and in them was this huge treasure. It's like national treasure, just like Nicolas Cage. They found it 2 years ago. Gold, diamonds, silver, jewelry, precious stones, an estimated worth of $25 billion, that's with a B, $25 billion. It was sitting there for 450 years, unguarded, 24/7, open to the public. They didn't know. They didn't know the treasure. You guys, well, fruit we're talking about this morning that's under the microscope, this fruit of the Spirit called patience, there is a treasure in this that we don't. The Bible gives us these little secret vaults and hints toward it, and we don't realize how incredible it is. That's what we're going to dig into just a little bit this morning. There is no law that can contain this fruit of patience. What happens as God is developing this in us changes us. It's just like a team that is moving toward the greatest game ever, the Super Bowl. What happens to the Ravens as they move toward that? What happens to the 49ers as they move? The great change that happens, the treasure, is the pursuit. It's not in the crown. It's what changes inside of those players as they get there. What happens to them? That's exactly what God is doing in us right now. We'll come to that in a second. Patience gets a bad rap in our culture. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a little book called Rules of Living years ago. He said, when you're angry, he was trying to develop patience in his readers. He said, when you're angry, count to 10 before you speak. And when you're very angry, count to 100. To which Mark Twain responded 75 years later, when angry, count to 4. When very angry, swear. Yeah, right. No, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. Anything, anyone, or any situation that we find bothersome or irritating is, no pun intended, Molly and Rebecca, pregnant with purpose. God is allowing something. Something is behind everything we encounter. God is doing it. He's allowing it to happen for a purpose. So what we see as an irritation is really producing for us something far more valuable than we could ever imagine. Have you ever seen this poem? There's different guys who have been credited with writing it, and I just decided it's unknown. I wrote it. Here, look at this poem. There once was an oyster whose story I tell, who found that some sand had got into his shell. It was only a grain, but it gave him great pain, for oysters have feelings, although they're so plain. Now, did he berate the harsh workings of fate that had brought him to such a deplorable state? Did he curse at the government, cry for election, and claim that the sea should have given him protection? No. He said to himself as he lay on a shell, since I cannot remove it, I shall try to improve it. Now, the years have rolled around, as the years always do, and he came to his ultimate destiny, stew. And the small grain of sand that had bothered him so was a beautiful pearl, all richly aglow. Now, the tale has a moral, for isn't it grand what an oyster can do with a morsel of sand? And couldn't we do if we'd only begin with some of the things that get under our skin? If our eyes could be open to what God is doing behind those things that we find so frustrating and so tormenting, we would open a secret chamber to an unbelievable treasure. So I think the challenge of what we've got left here today is to say, God, would you just open our eyes? And that's the first point. The first point of patience treasure. Got your program? Fill in those 4 blanks. It opens my eyes. You guys heard about the old preacher that got up to preach and he set the glass of water up on the pulpit. He started getting after it. He worked up to a heated part of his sermon, slammed down on the pulpit, and the glass spilled. The water came out, and without missing a beat, the preacher said, sometimes you don't know what's inside until you're upset. St. Francis of Assisi, look at the screen. He said, no one will ever know the full depth of his capacity for patience and humility as long as nothing bothers him. It is only when times are troubled and difficult that he can see how much of either is in it. Anybody here struggle? John Maxwell was the one that started using this language. Anybody struggle with this sort of FedEx personality? I've got that. I'm wired that way. I want movement. I want movement now. Remember the old thing when it absolutely, I made a new word. I like that word, absolutely. When it absolutely, positively has to be done now, delivered now. Have you ever wondered what we did before cell phones and email and texting? Y'all, what do we do? All of us are kind of FedEx people in a way. Have you ever thought about what they did 100 years ago with the Pony Express? When it absolutely, positively had to be there in 3 months? God isn't always a FedEx guy. I got to tell you, He did open the doors for us to move to a new facility really, really fast. We didn't see it happening that quickly. But He isn't always in the FedEx business. This fruit that we're looking at these weeks cannot be microwaved. It takes a process and it takes time. And patience is such a treasure because it opens our eyes to the value of slowing down. Americans hate it. There's value in slowing down. Did you know that there was a time when time wasn't measured in seconds and minutes? It was only 200 years ago. No clock had the seconds and the minutes on it. It's only the last 2 centuries that we've been measuring time with seconds and minutes. And we wear clocks on our wrists, and they're programmed into our cells, and they're in our computers. Standard equipment now, even in the most inexpensive cars, they're in our stoves, microwaves, coffee makers, refrigerators. How many clocks do we need in a kitchen? Just standard equipment. And why is it that anyone who drives slower than me is a moron, and anyone who drives faster than me is a maniac? Do you see the point that I'm saying? Until we get upset, we don't know really what's inside. So patience is such a treasure because it opens my eyes. I'm challenged to be patient, and exposes stuff in me that I need to know about. So that's number one. Treasure number two about patience is that it opens other people's eyes. You guys, this patience that we're talking about, we live in an impatient culture. So when patience shows up, people can't help but notice. It's almost like it's got a beacon, neon sign, big arrow pointing at it from the sky. And it's not just for people who don't have any kind of walk with the Lord. I mean, patience shows up in the church that belongs to Jesus. And people take notice there too, because we're an impatient people. It just shows up. It's so obvious. Pastor every day would, on his way to work to the church building, go by a lady that sold flowers. She had her little stand there and she sold flowers day after day. And he was one of those preachers that he would regularly buy a flower and cut off the stem and put it through a hole in his lapel. He was kind of a flower preacher. He just enjoyed doing that. So he'd go by and they'd have a little bit of exchange, and he'd meet up with her. Hey, how you doing today? Great, doing wonderful. In fact, her response was always, I'm doing wonderful. She would say that day after day, month after month, year after year. Finally, one day the preacher said, I'm always buying a flower from you, and I'm always asking how you're doing, and you're always saying I'm doing wonderful. He said, truthfully, you're not always doing wonderful. Nobody's always doing wonderful. Don't you have troubles? And she said, of course I have troubles. I've just learned how to handle them. Well, now the preacher, his interest was perfect. Okay, you got to tell me now. How do you handle your troubles? And this was her response. You're a pastor, you ought to know. And then she smiled and went on. Just think of Jesus on Good Friday. That was a terrible day for him. But 3 days later came the resurrection. She said, I've had a lot of Good Fridays in my life. I've had a lot of setbacks and a lot of dark times, a lot of difficulties. But every time I get hit with a Good Friday, I know that in 3 days or less, there's going to be something that opens up. Usually it happens before the end of the day. Sometimes when we go through rough stuff, have you ever said, let's just sleep on it. Let's just go to bed. Let's just sleep on it. See what happens. Usually the next day, the perspective, maybe the problem doesn't go away, but the perspective on the problem changes, doesn't it? And in 3 days, there's hope. And there's resurrection on the horizon. Our patience during tough times opens other people's eyes. Look, when we put up with people we would rather put down, people notice. When we accept a difficult situation without giving God a deadline, people notice. When we give others the time and space that we would like to have ourselves once in a while, people notice. When we do not quickly retaliate when we are wronged, people notice. When we accept delay or disappointment graciously, people notice. When we remain steadfast under stress and strain, people notice. And when we live in a calm endurance because we know that God is in control, people notice. You know what I just gave you? Every one of those things? Those are definitions to patience. That's patience. And you can't help but be noticed by the world, both believing and unbelieving, when that fruit is seen. And that's a good thing. When we allow God to come in and totally develop this fruit in our lives, it opens other people's eyes to the wonder of our God. And how in the world do you put a price tag on that kind of example? That is such a great commodity. And then finally, I think the greatest treasure in patience is that God does His thing. He's changed. Do you know God loves you so much? He accepts you just as you are. But because He loves you so much, He refuses to leave you that way. He won't leave you where you are. You start walking with Him and He'll start changing you. That's the treasure. We get changed more into the likeness of the one that made us. You bear His image. We're all image bearers. You already bear His image, and when you start walking with Him, He just starts chipping away at that marble. The next thing you know, man, you got something good. What God is developing in us is wild with possibility. And what God is developing in us will take time. Thus, we need a fruit that is not of man, but is of the Spirit. Patience. Think about Moses. The story of Moses is mind-boggling anyway. I mean, God says, all right, I see my children that have been in slavery for 400 years and they're crying out under this cruel bondage, and I'm going to deliver them, and I'm going to raise up the deliverer from their own ranks. Pharaoh catches wind of this and he says, yeah, over my dead body. Hey, soldiers, kill all the babies. Kill all the baby boys in the Hebrew nation. And what does God do? He has Pharaoh's own daughter raise the deliverer under his roof. I love God doing stuff like that. So, Moses, at least 40 years old, he sees one of the Egyptians mistreating one of his fellow Jewish brethren. And he says, I'm not going to stand up for that. Kills that Egyptian, buries him in the sand, doesn't know people have seen it. Next day he's walking around, sees a couple of his Jewish brothers fighting with each other, and they say, oh, you're going to kill us and bury us too? Moses realizes he's in trouble, so he flees. He's 40 years old. Guess what he does for the next 40 years? From 40 to 80 years old. He follows sheep around in a wilderness, lives like a nomad, in the middle of a desert called Midian. You think about this. God isn't always in the FedEx business. God's model for developing patience, when it absolutely positively has to be there in 40 years. Our best attributes are developed over time. And really, I think the good stuff that comes out in us because of the Spirit comes through times of despair and discouragement and doubt. Can you imagine the mind renewal that would happen if we looked at our despairing, desperate, depressing moments as, oh my goodness, I'm about to open a secret vault and enter a hidden chamber. I'm about to get covered with treasure from above. Can you imagine? You talk about a mind renewal. Hey, Jim, how you doing? Man, I'm going through a rough time. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not. I'm about to open the vault door. I do not even come close to living like that. But what would happen if we did? Joseph, the favored son, with the coat of many colors. Do you know he spent years and years in prison? David, the beloved king of Israel, spent a majority of his life alone with sheep in a pasture, and then, knowing he was the anointed king, he went around like a refugee in caves, trying to keep his life safe from a lunatic of a king before him. Jesus himself spent the first 30 years of his life in preparation for a short 3-year ministry. You guys, every great man and woman of the Bible didn't go through the microwave process of letting this fruit come out. No, they went through the crock pot process. The treasure of patience is what God does in the process. He puts us in the crock pot so that our lives start to simmer, and that aroma just starts to fill up everything that we're about. And the next thing you know, what the world sees is that, man, have you tasted on that Christian, that person that walked with Jesus? I'm telling you what I taste and see is good. And they get a picture of our Father. Little kid was in a mall, and he was standing at the bottom of the escalator. And he was just staring at the rail. He wasn't next to the steps. He was just staring at the rail. And a security mall cop saw this little boy standing so close to the escalator. You know, he was wondering why he wasn't getting on and why he was just standing there. And the security cop said, hey, he walked over. Hey, man, you lost? He said, no, I'm just waiting. The security cop said, what are you waiting for? The little boy said, I put my gum on that rail and I'm waiting for it to come back around. I love that story because you know what? We have something, every one of us, maybe our most prized possession. You know what it is? It's your God-given right to choose to trust in Jesus. You get to do that. He doesn't force you. That's why it's love. If he forces you, it isn't love. But he gives you the right to choose whether or not you want to trust in Jesus. And we take that faith and we put it in the care of God. And you know what God is doing? He said that He's coming back. And so we're just kind of waiting for that rail. You don't think I'm speaking the truth, do you? Look at the screen. This is 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12. I know the one I have put my trust in, and I am sure that He is able to protect what I have put into His care until that day. Once this truth of our trust in Jesus, once that truth is deeply planted into us, will start budding all over the place, and people will take notice. Our eyes will be open, and God will get the glory because He's doing His work. So what do? While we're waiting for that rail to come back around, while we're waiting for Jesus' return, while we're waiting, we're going to worship, we're going to follow, we're not going to faint, we're going to be patient.